guys, what's going on? It's Preacher, and if you listen to the web show, which I hope you did, you will have realised that I am now not a rogue. I have hung up the daggers, which is really sad. We put in so much effort at the beginning of WOD in order to pick a class. Went through so many factors. You remember that entire, probably month-long section where we covered each of the possibilities, we looked at what pros and cons they had, and ultimately I decided on a rogue, which I'm happy to say was the correct choice for the reasons I chose it for. Not only did it bring great DPS, but the fact that it had the 3 specs meant they were always going to be good in some way or another, and their utility, which didn't look to be nerfed in the pre-WOD notes, meant that they would have all these extra options of things to do, which really, really appeals to me. I like having all these extra options and extra ways to help the raid, whether it be soaking or kiting and all that kind of stuff. So I made the correct choice, and I've been really happy with the playstyle of my rogue over the course of WOD. So there was no issue there. So why the reroll? Why did we say, okay, enough is enough, maybe it's time for a change? Mostly, it's down to the RPPM world that we now live in. Now, as somebody who didn't go, wasn't particularly a raider in Mr. Pandaria, I focused on making my YouTube channel a solid and sustainable form of income for my family and having my first kid and all that kind of stuff. I missed out on the snapshot universe and being able to do crazy, spectacular things with everything lining up. And as we discussed in the DPS week, we now live in the RPPM world, which is, you know, procs can go off as and when. And it's Blizzard's effort to take control, in many ways, out of the maximum potential of your character away from the player and put it in generally in the hands of the game. And what they're hoping for is, while this makes individuals suffer, the overall DPS of the raid is very consistent. So that kind of works in that respect. So you don't have players of various skill levels doing dramatically different damage in the same gear. That's what they were aiming for, where a lot of the stuff that really contributes to massive amounts of damage and weaker phases and all that kind of stuff is actually taken away from you, and it will happen naturally, and it's not something you need to worry about, and you just use your actual class cooldowns, and if they line up, fair enough. If they don't, they don't. But overall, it'll work out nicely, because given the actual nature and spread of the raid, somebody will have a good moment, somebody will have a bad moment, and it'll all work out nicely on average. And that works quite well. I think that started to bother me probably early Blackrock Foundry, where we had several moments where on-demand burst was required. And as a player who wants to be, like, on call for that, and like, you want me in the raid to make sure that happens, you can check my logs every single time, and you will notice that when I need to be somewhere and that thing needs to die, I will be there, my cooldowns will be saved, and I'll be ready to fucking rock and roll. Now, I started to get a little bit sighy, a little bit meh, when having controlled my character in that way didn't really end up with the results I wanted to see. And even going as far as to say anybody who didn't do that could sometimes outperform me. And that was like, oh, what's going on here? And this is the RPPM nature. Sometimes things swung in their favour through no doing of their own, and sometimes it swung in my favour through no doing of my own. And in fact, the ability to really control what my character could produce was taken away. The final nail in the coffin, and I did suggest that I would be up for tanking when we had a tanking spot come open in the guild, probably about mid-Blackrock Foundry. There was a tanking spot opening up, and I'd taken a greater interest in tanking, but we'll get to that shortly. So the final nail in the coffin was definitely Blackhand Mythic. Blackhand Mythic, as you probably know if you've ever progressed in it or killed it, which I hope you have, because it's a fight worthy of killing. Not the best fight by any means, I actually think it's quite dull, but it's a fight worth killing. It's very tightly tuned and a lot of personal responsibility, blah, blah, blah. You obviously do many pulls if you're progressing on it normally and doing various things. And a lot of that, of course, involves Phase 1. And Phase 1 lasts about a minute and a half, and nothing really highlighted just how much of my character's potential, and this is the important thing, my character's potential was in fact not in my hands. The variance on damage output from my character during Phase 1 over the a couple of hundred, if not more, pulls that we did on that fight became abundantly clear over and over and over again, because it's about a minute and a half, and in that minute and a half you are attempting to do the best damage you can. And the variance on damage that I saw there could range wildly wildly. I could finish that minute and a half phase with about 52, 53k on some occasions, and then on other occasions you'd be down 47, 46k. You're like, whoa, 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 that's nearly a 10k difference, dude. What the fuck is going on here? How am I pressing the exact same buttons? And the interesting thing about phase 1 is it's so predictable, and the gains that you get on your character are actually so predetermined after so many pulls that you press the exact same buttons in exactly the same order every single time, and you literally got to do this hundreds of times. So there was essentially, barring some minor mistake or something going a little bit iffy, a bad bomb or whatever, that I was doing the exact same thing over and over and over and over and over again, and the results were always different. I'm sure of the amount of pulls, the average DPS I pulled was probably about the same. But that doesn't appeal to me in the least. It really doesn't. When I need to do on demand, I want to be able to push my character to its maximum wherever possible. And I could not do that. I could not do that. Essentially, I would press the exact same buttons, maintain the... And this is more rogue specific, so don't worry if you don't get it. Maintain my... really nice fine weakness uptime, refreshing at like 0.2 seconds to make sure that it was really clutch, get the maximum out of it. And even on some tries, and some rogues, sub-rogues will be able to appreciate this, is on a very nasty pre-pull, which can occasionally happen, very rarely, but it does, where I had to use a vanish and I didn't reset prep quick enough. I would go into that phase with one less vanish. And on some occasions when that happened, I would yield more DPS out of my character despite having one less vanish to maintain a lot more fine weakness uptime. And that was when I was like, you know, I'm really pushing, like, I'm using add-ons and stuff to track this to the perfect moment and to make sure everything is super crispy. And it really kind of almost doesn't matter. And that's when I was kind of done with being a DPS. And now this affects this. I'm not shitting on DPS here, or rogues even. What I'm saying is that certainly this affected rogues in a big way, especially with our 1 minute cooldowns, because we're mostly playing sub. But other DPS classes are affected by this far less. So you could say, well, you could just roll to another DPS class. But after the considerations I gave to becoming a rogue, I didn't really see another DPS class I wanted to be, honestly. And they all suffer from it in one degree or another. The feeling... Let me give you an example of the feeling. A lot of the times when let's say I became #1 on the DPS meter, which happened on occasion. That wouldn't make me excited. What I would actually think in my mind was, oh, the mages must have had bad RNG. And that's a feeling I don't want. It's like, oh, look at me. Everybody else must have had a bad moment. You know what I mean? Yeah, I had a great moment. That was cool. But everybody else had a pretty sad moment. And that's the feeling that I walked away with. And that's never nice. It's not like, oh shit, I did really well here. It was in the favor of the gods. RNGesus was smiling upon me and not smiling on someone else. And therefore, I definitely felt flat in those moments. Now, I'm certainly not saying here, for clarification, that I want to be #1 in the DPS. That has absolutely no relevance here. What I want to see is the same number, pretty much, every time I do the exact same thing. I want to see the same results. I want consistency. If I want to push myself to be, say, the best rogue or whatever, like we've done in the past and I've told stories about when I did it with the Death Knight, that was in my hands back then pretty much. I mean, although weapon enchants are pretty random, you could kind of work around that because there wasn't as much RPPM or random procs going on. You could work around it quite nicely, and therefore it wasn't a big deal because it actually became part of the player's skill to work around it. But when you have so many, when you've got double weapon enchants, trinket procs, ring procs, all that kind of stuff going off, all these different procs that add up in different ways, then there's a lot less chance of being able to work around it successfully, especially when you're dealing with low downtime cooldowns. And therefore it became very meh. And ultimately it made me kind of sloppy because I felt, you know, it doesn't really matter anymore, and that's a bad feeling to have as a DPS, because you want to be ruthless, you want to really push yourself, you want to be a damage dealer, you want to fuck something in the arse, you want to make it painful and brutal, and I just felt like it didn't really matter anymore. A lot of this stuff was actually in the hands of the game, rather than me. Although I had obviously a significant input on that, being able to push to be competitive. If I get a try where I'm like doing really well, that's cool, but then I might have 6 tries where the RNG doesn't smile in my favour, and it's nothing to do with player skill. Ultimately, it's nothing to do with your ability to be a DPSer. It's just out of your hands completely. And that's why I did DPS week, where I was like, look, guys, rankings really don't mean a whole fucking lot anymore. 1, we all have different jobs. And 2, a lot of the stuff is actually out of your hands. And therefore, it doesn't matter, whatever the result is. If someone has a really good day, they can be #1. And as I showed, and as I proved to myself, is that I can actually have ridiculous things happen, like not have access to one of my cooldowns and still yield more DPS than if I had access to that cooldown, which should never happen. That should never happen. I shouldn't have one less cooldown and do more damage. That makes no sense to me at all, but it's what I observed. I, like, evidently observed that happening on some occasions, so that made me sad. So that was the reasons to essentially stop being a DPS. Not a rogue, essentially, just stop being a DPS. That kind of aspect of the game is a little bit dead to me right now. I would like to see that changed in the future, or perhaps it's going to stick this way, as we've seen with the new set bonuses. A lot of passive damage that's not really in your hands. The summoning of pets or familiars, or whatever you want to call, to do damage for you whenever the game decides that it wants you to do them. And yeah, that's the way the game is right now. That's the way it is. I understand that over the course of a fight, average DPS across the whole raid is about the same, so it's no big deal. But for my own personal sense of competition, I was not enjoying it, so that's why I moved away from it. So I chose tanking. Why was tanking taking interest? I've hated tanking for a long time in terms of being a raid tank. There was a lot of stuff. I think in Kata, there was very little a tank could do to affect the sway of a fight. And being a classic tank, I was a tank for like 3 expansions, pretty much non-stop, and playing super hardcore as a tank. It was one of the most in-depth experiences of my life, in constant maximization of how we can do things and alter things and make things happen. So long-time followers of the channel will know that. But if you don't know that, just bear in mind that I was a tank for an extremely long time, and was at my absolute best, my pinnacle, when I was a tank. And the amount of effort I put into tanking to correct raid mistakes without the raid even realizing we were doing it, especially when I had a good partner as a tank, was the best feeling ever. Because you could take a weaker player and do things as a tank, such as positioning, or the way you would just handle certain mechanics that would make them better without them having to realize that it was because of you. And I really enjoyed that. It was good to theory craft how we could make those things happen and increase raid performance as a result. Now, a long time that kind of got took away, and tanking got stuck in this tank swap area of the game for a really long time. It seemed like the devs didn't really know what the fuck to do with tanks. They were like, well, we need 2 tanks. What can we give them to do? Because threat's not a thing anymore. So when I was really at my pinnacle, threat was a huge deal. Gurtog Bloodboil, who recently has made his resurface, was a huge deal for tanks because you had to manage threat in a way we hadn't seen since Veilstraz. And that was difficult. No taunt mechanics. And when all bosses became tauntable, pretty much, it was kind of a sad time because threat obviously had no reason to exist. And that's the only mechanic they could put in, but they still wanted tank swaps, so it just meant taunting. It just meant counting debuffs and making sure you swap at the right time. And that really displeased me. And in MOP, we had the addition of Vengeance. This is when tanking basically died for me as something of interest. Because now we're talking about a mechanic where it was regularly and widespread considered to be the best way to play, to use your defensive cooldowns to absorb damage that you shouldn't be taking in the first place, to push your ridiculous damage. And that, as a tank, I'm old school, I'll admit it, I'm old school. I don't care what my DPS is as a tank. It's not why I'm in the raid as far as I'm concerned. And this mechanic really put me off tanking. Not that there was anything wrong with it, and a lot of players enjoyed it. I get it. Just wasn't for me. I just didn't like it. I thought, you know what, if I'm having to use my shield wall to soak annihilating smash or whatever, then yeah, that's not for me. I don't like it. I don't want to be sat there with a vengeance meter measuring that shit and trying to get the biggest and best executes out that I can do. That's not for me anyway, so I just totally ignored it. So they dropped Vengeance, which I was really happy about, but didn't really notice the effect it would have. Not only that, but WoD has picked up its game in terms of tank functionality. Lots of mobility going on, and this is where I really enjoy myself. Mobility means you can do cool stuff. Lots of stuff changed with that, including the dropping of Vengeance and the introduction of Resolve, which by itself, I think we can all agree, is very boring. Resolve is super boring, but it makes a lot of sense. It's a nice, elegant solution to making tank cooldowns effective in a raid environment while not ruining the outside world. So we don't have people popping 1 million guards or whatever it is while out in the natural world where people are having to bring a raid boss to kill the tank. That's fucking garbage, and we're glad to see that that's not the case. So Resolve is a rather elegant solution to that, while still making these abilities very, very useful in a raid environment where you're going to take that kind of damage, but not ruining the outside world for anyone. So I liked Resolve. It was boring, but it made sense. It made sense, it works, I'm fine with it. It's not something I really have to measure, I just take advantage of it when I'm actually tanking. Not only that, but the tanking game got turned up a little bit by Blizz. Tanks had way more to do. There was so much more going on in even in Highmore, let alone Blackrock Foundry, that I found myself a little bit envious. And I started always considering in my head, what would I do here as a tank? What could I adjust this? What if I taunt it here? What if we position this? And certainly as a melee, there are plenty of occasions where it's like, wow, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that. I'd be thinking about the melee in the situation. Maybe we should change this in order to make the melee better. And obviously I was then making suggestions as a tank. Can we do this? Can we do that? Can we improve this in some way? And these were all things like, God, I wish I was tanking right now, because I would like to be able to be in the position where I could see this coming. And that to me is really interesting raid gameplay, because we're constantly making adjustments that make things work. So tanking looked more appealing every single fucking day. Feeling flat with DPS, not particularly wanting to go healer, and tanking starting to look very, very inviting. Really like the mechanics. So I suggested it, and the officers pulled me aside. Now, there is one big issue with this. So I'm a tank now, and I chose a warrior. I think I'll wait for the... What I'm going to do is I'm going to cover the why I chose a warrior in the tank review, which is coming in a couple of days. The ranged one is next. Don't worry, the ranged one is coming out. It'll be out tomorrow. But the tanking one I'll cover in there, why a warrior. So I suggested it, and it does have a couple of drawbacks. One, I'm having a new child in about 2 months. So what that will do to my rating, I don't know. But we talked about it openly as like, look, yeah, I'm totally up for doing this. I'll invest the cash money, the time, all that kind of stuff. Do some alt raids. Let's get in there. Let's get some gear. It's a good time to do it because we can just kick off Hellfire Citadel with some normal modes, grab some upgrades towards a mythicish item level, and then we can crack on as normal so we don't lose that much progress time. And ultimately, we're not going for the world's fastest kills here, so it doesn't really fucking matter. But yeah, I might have a kid. I definitely have a kid coming, so I don't know how that will play out. The guild was pretty fine with it. Like, it's okay, we'll try it out. Maybe it's going to be fine, maybe it won't be, but we can work around that. There are other guys in the raid who want to tank should it be a big issue, so no big deal. So I think that summarizes quite well why tank, and I hope that sits well with some of you. And I don't know if many of you have had this other feelings. Are you feeling like that with your DPSs? I'd love to know, guys. I really would. Thank you for listening. I'll see you again. Bye-bye.